I'll find you again, Sarah. No matter how far away they take me, I promise I'll find you. Those words, spoken by a 10-year-old boy with tears streaming down his dirt-smudged cheeks 27 years ago, echoed through Serafina Delacroix's mind as she stood frozen in the opulent auction hall of Monaco's Grand Hotel. Her champagne flute trembled in her manicured hand, the crystal catching the light from the massive chandelier above, casting rainbows that seemed to mock the storm, brewing in her chest. Because there, across the sea of designer gowns and perfectly pressed tuxedos, past the priceless artifacts waiting to exchange hands for astronomical sums, stood the boy who had made that impossible promise. Aurelius Blackmont. But no longer a boy. Time had sculpted him into something magnificent and dangerous. Broad shoulders that filled out an impeccably tailored midnight blue suit, silver threading through hair that had once been the color of summer wheat, and those eyes. Dear God. Those impossible emerald eyes that had once held hers as he pressed a dandelion behind her ear, and whispered secrets only the wind was meant to hear. The same eyes that were now staring directly at her with the force of recognition striking like lightning. Madame Delacroix. The auction assistant's voice seemed to drift from another dimension. Your paddle for lot 17? Serafina blinked, realizing she'd been caught in his gravitational pull for what felt like an eternity, but had probably been mere seconds. Around them, the auction continued its elegant dance of wealth and desire, voices calling out bids in multiple currencies, while waiters glided between tables like ghosts carrying liquid gold in crystal glasses. The lot in question was a vintage Cartier necklace, something she'd planned to acquire for her boutique's upcoming Love Through the Ages exhibition. How ironically appropriate, given that her own Love Through the Ages was currently excusing himself from the stunning redhead draped on his arm like a living accessory. Serafina? Philippe Moncler's cultured French accent cut through her reverie. Her distinguished companion, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and worth approximately 3 small countries, followed her gaze with the sharp instincts of a man who'd built his financial empire by reading every micro-expression in every room he'd ever entered. Someone of interest? Someone of interest? The understatement almost made her laugh hysterically. This was the boy who'd taught her to climb trees and catch fireflies, who'd shared his lunch when her grandmother couldn't afford to pack one, who'd held her hand during thunderstorms and promised they'd see Paris together someday. Now here she was in Monaco, successful beyond her childhood dreams, wearing a gown that cost more than her grandmother's cottage had been worth. And there he was, Aurelius Blackmont, the tech mogul whose innovations had revolutionized global communication, whose wealth could probably purchase principalities. And he was walking toward her. I thought I knew him once, she whispered, then immediately regretted the admission. It revealed too much, like accidentally leaving a diary open to the most intimate page. Aurelius moved through the crowd with that same fluid confidence she remembered. People naturally parted before him, drawn by the magnetic presence that had made him the undisputed leader of their childhood adventures. He'd been the boy who could convince anyone to follow him anywhere, no matter how impossible the destination. He'd convinced her to believe in forever when they were children. Then his family's black limousines had taken him away to a world she'd never imagined she'd someday inhabit herself. Lot 17, ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer's voice boomed across the hall. This exquisite 1920s Cartier necklace, formerly owned by the Duchess of Windsor. But Serafina heard nothing, except the thundering of her own heartbeat as Aurelius stopped just 10 feet away, close enough that she could see the subtle lines time had etched around those unforgettable eyes. Close enough to notice he still had that tiny scar above his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen out of their favorite climbing tree trying to rescue her doll. Their gazes locked and the universe held its breath. In that suspended moment, she watched recognition bloom across his features, wonder, disbelief, and something deeper that made her knees forget how to support her weight. His lips parted as if to speak her name, and she realized with crystalline clarity that this man, this powerful, sophisticated stranger who shared a face with her dearest memory, was just as shaken as she was. Sold! The auctioneer's gavel crashed down like thunder. Lot 17 to paddle 247. Serafina looked down in shock at her raised paddle. She'd bid without conscious thought, her hand moving independently while her mind reeled through decades of buried dreams. "Congratulations, darling," Philippe murmured, but his attention was laser-focused on the approaching figure who moved with the predatory grace that powerful men wore like expensive cologne. Serafina rose. The voice was deeper now, seasoned by years of boardroom negotiations and probably too many late nights building his empire. But it still held that hint of reverent wonder he'd always gotten when he looked at her, as if she were some magical creature he'd discovered in an enchanted forest. He was the only person who'd ever called her by both names, as if one wasn't sufficient to contain everything she was. "Hello, Aurelius," she managed. Amazed, her voice emerged, steady despite the earthquake fracturing her composure, and as their eyes met again, green fire meeting amber silk, she realized that some promises, even those made by children who didn't understand the weight of their words, had the power to reshape destiny itself. The silence stretched between them like a bridge made of spun glass, beautiful, fragile, and terrifying to cross. Around them, the auction continued its choreographed dance of wealth and acquisition. But Serafina felt as though she and Aurelius existed in a bubble outside of time, where the rules of polite society couldn't quite reach. "You look..." Aurelius began, then stopped, his composed businessman facade cracking just enough to reveal something vulnerable underneath. "You look exactly as I imagined you would." "You imagined me?" The question escaped before she could stop it, carrying more breathless wonder than she'd intended. Philippe cleared his throat with the delicate precision of a man accustomed to navigating social complexities. "Perhaps introductions are in order." His voice carried that particular French diplomacy that could make even territorial marking sound civilized. Aurelius's attention shifted to Philippe with the calculating assessment of a man who'd learned to read competitors in milliseconds. "Aurelius Blackmont," he said, extending a hand that Serafina remembered building sandcastles and catching tadpoles. "And you are?" "Philippe Montclair, Serafina's..." Philippe paused, and she realized with startling clarity that neither of them had ever defined exactly what they were to each other. Companions, partners, something more, something less. "Friend," he finished, though his hand found the small of her back with gentle possession. "Friend," Aurelius repeated, and something flickered in his eyes. Relief? Calculation? Hope? Before Serafina could decipher it, a vision in crimson silk materialized at Aurelius's elbow, like a beautiful, predatory flower. "Darling, you've disappeared," the redhead purred, her accent carrying hints of somewhere expensive and exclusive. Everything about her screamed thoroughbred, from her perfectly sculpted cheekbones to the way she moved like she'd been trained since birth to be admired. "I was beginning to think you'd been spirited away by art thieves." Aurelius's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Valentina Ashworth, meet Serafina Delacroix and Philippe Montclair." He gestured between them with mechanical politeness. "Valentina is..." Now it was his turn to pause, searching for definition. "My business partner." Business partner. The phrase hung in the air like expensive perfume, pleasant on the surface but cloying if you breathed too deeply. Valentina's smile sharpened with the precision of a blade wrapped in silk. "How delightful," Valentina said, her gaze cataloging Serafina with the efficiency of a luxury appraiser. "You have such an interesting look. Very authentic." The word authentic somehow managed to sound like an insult wrapped in tissue paper. Philippe's hand pressed more firmly against Serafina's back, but she barely noticed. She was too busy watching Aurelius watch her, as if he were memorizing her face all over again. "Serafina owns several exclusive boutiques," Philippe said, smoothly. "Her eye for beauty is quite renowned throughout Europe." "How entrepreneurial," Valentina replied, though her tone suggested entrepreneurship was something one did when one couldn't simply inherit wealth. "And what type of boutiques?" "Vintage couture and estate jewelry," Serafina found her voice. lifting her chin with the pride she'd earned through years of building something from nothing. "I specialize in pieces with stories, items that carry the romance and dreams of their previous owners." Aurelius's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Like treasure hunting for memories." "Exactly like that." The words came out softer than she'd intended, intimate in a way that made both Valentina and Philippe shift slightly. Because he understood. After all these years, he still understood the way her mind worked, the way she saw magic in forgotten things. When they were children, she'd collected smooth stones and pressed flowers, convinced each one held secrets from the universe. He'd been the only one who never laughed at her collections, who'd helped her build elaborate stories about where each treasure had come from. "How quaint," Valentina murmured, though her smile had developed an edge that could cut crystal. "Aurelius, darling, didn't you say we needed to speak with the Morettis about the Milan project before they leave?" It was clearly a strategic retreat masked as social obligation. Aurelius glanced at his watch, a gesture Serafina remembered from childhood, though then it had been a battered digital watch his grandmother had given him, not the understated Patek Philippe that probably cost more than most people's cars. Of course. He looked back at Serafina, and for a moment his carefully constructed public persona slipped entirely. "It was extraordinary seeing you again." Extraordinary. Such a careful word, so perfectly neutral it could mean anything. But his eyes said things his mouth couldn't, painted pictures his voice wouldn't dare attempt. "The pleasure was entirely mutual," Philippe interjected smoothly, extending his hand to Aurelius. "Perhaps we'll see you both again before the evening ends." As the couple separated, Aurelius and Valentina gliding toward a cluster of intimidating-looking Italians, Philippe guiding Serafina toward the bar, she couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous had just occurred. Not the reunion itself, though that had shaken her to her core, but something in those final moments of their conversation. A recognition, a remembering, a door opening that she'd thought had been bricked shut decades ago. "You're trembling," Philippe observed as he handed her a fresh glass of champagne. His dark eyes held the kind of concern that came from genuine affection rather than mere politeness. "Am I?" She looked down at her hands in surprise. Indeed, they were shaking like autumn leaves. "I suppose seeing someone from childhood can be unsettling." "Childhood," Philippe repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I imagine it can be. Especially when that someone has grown up to be one of the most powerful men in the world." He paused, studying her face with the attention he usually reserved for analyzing market trends. "Were you close?" The question was casual, but Serafina knew Philippe well enough to recognize the careful intelligence behind it. He was a man who'd built his fortune by understanding people, by reading the invisible threads that connected hearts and motivations and desires. "We were children," she said finally. "Everything feels more intense when you're 8 years old." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't exactly the truth either. What she and Aurelius had shared had been intense, yes, but it had also been profound, in a way that she'd never quite recaptured with anyone else. He'd been her best friend, her confidant, her first love, though she'd been too young to name it that at the time. "Of course," Philippe agreed, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Shall we find our table? I believe dinner service begins soon." As they walked through the glittering crowd, Serafina caught herself scanning the room for a glimpse of midnight blue fabric, for the particular way Aurelius held his shoulders, for that profile that had haunted her dreams for longer than she cared to admit. She found him near the windows overlooking Monaco's harbor, where million-dollar yachts bobbed like expensive toys in the moonlight. He was nodding at something Valentina was saying, but his attention kept drifting toward the glass, toward the reflection of the room behind him. Toward her reflection, she realized with a start. Their eyes met in the window's surface, a ghostly communication across the crowded room, and she felt that familiar flutter in her chest, the same one she'd felt when he'd kissed her cheek goodbye all those years ago and whispered that promise that had somehow, impossibly, come true. He had found her again. The question now was what they were going to do about it. The dinner portion of the evening unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated symphony, each course arriving with theatrical precision while conversations flowed in, multiple languages across tables that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Serafina found herself seated at a table with Philippe, two Italian art collectors, a Russian oil heiress, and a British lord, who insisted on recounting his recent safari adventures with exhausting enthusiasm. She nodded and smiled and made appropriate conversational responses, but her attention kept drifting 3 tables away, where Aurelius sat with Valentina and what appeared to be half of Monaco's financial elite. Even from a distance, she could see the way he commanded the conversation, not through domination, but through that magnetic charisma that had made him impossible to ignore even as a child. "The crème brûlée is exceptional," Philippe murmured in her ear, his voice carrying gentle amusement. "Though I suspect you haven't tasted yours." Serafina glanced down at her untouched dessert, the caramelized sugar surface reflecting the candlelight like a golden mirror. "I suppose I'm not very hungry." "No," Philippe agreed, his fingers finding hers beneath the pristine white tablecloth. "I suspect your appetite has been distracted." Before she could respond, the evening's entertainment began. A string quartet, taking their positions near the windows, while couples began gravitating toward the impromptu dance floor that had been cleared in the center of the hall. The music that filled the air was hauntingly beautiful, something classical and romantic that seemed designed to make hearts remember what they'd forgotten. "Shall we?" Philippe stood and offered his hand with the elegant formality that made him such perfect company for events like these. He was sophisticated, cultured, genuinely kind, everything a woman her age should want in a companion. So why did her treacherous heart keep searching the crowd for someone else? They moved together with practiced ease, Philippe's hand warm and steady at her waist as they swayed to the violin's sweet melancholy. He was an excellent dancer, confident without being showy, leading without being controlling. The kind of partner who made a woman feel graceful and cherished. "You're thinking very loudly," he observed after they'd completed several turns around the floor. "Am I?" She tried to focus on him, on the moment, on the beautiful evening they were sharing. "I apologize. That's terribly rude of me." "Not rude," he corrected gently. "Human. Seeing someone from our past can stir up sediment we thought had settled permanently." The metaphor was so perfectly Philippe, elegant, precise, and surprisingly insightful. "Is that what you think is happening?" "I think," he said, spinning her slowly before drawing her back into his arms, "that some chapters of our lives leave deeper impressions than others. And sometimes, when we least expect it, we discover the ink never quite dried." His words carried such understanding that she felt a rush of affection for him, this sophisticated, perceptive man who saw her struggles without judgment. She was about to tell him how much his patience meant to her when a familiar voice interrupted. "Excuse me." Aurelius appeared beside them with the kind of polished confidence that suggested he was accustomed to interrupting whatever he chose. "Might I cut in?" The question was directed at Philippe, following proper social etiquette, but Aurelius's eyes never left Serafina's face. Philippe's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist, not possessively, but protectively. "Of course," Philippe replied with gracious civility, though something in his tone suggested he was marking territory as much as granting permission. He pressed a kiss to Serafina's gloved hand. "I'll be at the bar when you're ready." And then, she was in Aurelius's arms. The transition should have been seamless, one partner replaced by another, the music continuing its romantic spell. But nothing about this felt smooth or practiced, or safe. His hand at her waist burned through the silk of her gown, and when his fingers interlaced with hers, she could feel the calluses that spoke of someone who still worked with his hands despite his billions. "You're trembling again," he observed, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the strings and the whispered conversations of other dancers. "The evening has been unexpected. That's one word for it." He guided her through a turn, and she was startled by how perfectly they moved together, as if their bodies remembered rhythms their minds had forgotten. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. The admission was so quietly vulnerable that it made her chest ache. Remember you? Aurelius? You were my whole world for 6 years. The words hung between them like a confession, more honest than she'd intended to be. His step faltered almost imperceptibly, and she saw something raw and unguarded flash across his features. You were mine too, he said simply, especially after everything changed. Your family moved so suddenly. One day you were there and the next. She let the sentence trail off, because they both knew how it had ended, with promises and tears and a little girl who'd climbed their oak tree every day for months hoping to see his golden hair through the leaves. My father's business expanded overseas. He said we needed to be closer to the European markets. Aurelius's voice carried the weight of old pain carefully contained. I wasn't given much choice in the matter. You were 10 years old. Of course, you weren't given a choice. I fought them, he said, and she could picture him doing exactly that. The fierce, determined boy who'd once staged a one-person rebellion when the town council wanted to cut down their climbing tree. I threatened to run away to hide in the woods until they agreed to let me stay. My grandmother finally sat me down and explained that sometimes love means letting go, even when it feels impossible. The music swelled around them, violins soaring towards something that sounded like heartbreak, set to melody. Other couples moved past them in elegant circles, but Serafina felt as though she and Aurelius were dancing alone in the universe. I looked for you, she whispered. When I got older, when the internet became a thing, I searched your name 1,000 times, but Blackmon is common enough, and I didn't know where you'd gone. We changed our name when we moved to America, he explained. Legal reasons, something about protecting business interests. We became the Blackmonts when we left England. He paused, his thumb tracing across her knuckles in a gesture that sent electricity straight to her heart. I looked for you too. Every search engine, every social media platform, but Delacroix is my married name, she finished quietly. I was Rose Whitmore then. Rose Whitmore from Little Brambleworth. Rose Whitmore, he repeated, and the way he said her original name made it sound like a prayer. God, I was so stupid. I should have tried harder, should have. We were children, she interrupted gently. We did what children do. We grew up and built lives and tried to move forward. Did you? His question was barely audible over the music. Move forward? The honest answer was complicated, layered with years of trying to find what she'd lost, of building a successful business and maintaining friendships and even marrying a kind man who'd died too young, all while carrying the secret belief that she'd never again find the kind of connection she'd shared with a golden-haired boy in a tiny English village. I tried, she said instead. So did I. His admission carried equal weight. I built companies and conquered markets and surrounded myself with brilliant people. I told myself I was living exactly the life I was meant to live. And were you? The song was ending, the violins drawing out their final haunting notes while couples around them began to separate and applaud. But Aurelius made no move to release her, and she made no move to step away. I thought I was, he said, his green eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world blur at the edges. Until tonight. Until I saw you standing, there in that blue gown looking like every dream I'd convinced myself to forget. The applause erupted around them, breaking the spell. Reality crashed back, the elegant crowd, the watching eyes, the fact that they both had companions waiting for them at opposite sides of the room. Serafina stepped back, her hand slipping from his with reluctance that felt like tearing. I should get back to Philippe, she said, though her feet seemed rooted to the marble floor. And I should find Valentina. He didn't move either. They stood there in the space between songs, between past and present, between what was and what might have been. Around them, the evening continued its sophisticated dance, but something had fundamentally shifted in the space they occupied. Serafina, Her name on his lips sounded like a question, a plea, a promise all wrapped together. Yes? Would you… that is, could I… He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made her heart stutter. Could I see you again, away from all this? He gestured toward the glittering crowd, the watching eyes, the complications that surrounded them like beautiful, suffocating walls. The smart answer would have been no. The safe answer would have been to smile politely and wish him well and return to her carefully constructed life. The responsible answer would have been to remember Felipe's kindness and Valentina's territorial glances and all the reasons why revisiting the past was a dangerous game. Instead, she heard herself whisper, yes. The little cafe tucked into a narrow side street of Monaco's old quarter was worlds away from the glittering opulence of the previous evening. No crystal chandeliers here, no designer gowns or million-dollar yachts visible through the windows, just weathered stone walls, mismatched vintage chairs, and the kind of intimate atmosphere that made secrets feel safe to share. Serafina arrived first, choosing a corner table where the morning light filtered through lace curtains like spun gold. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of their dance, every word they'd exchanged, every look that had passed, between them like encrypted messages only they could decode. When she'd finally drifted off near dawn, she'd dreamed of willow trees and dandelion wishes, and a boy who'd promised to find her again. Now, watching him approach through the cafe's window, casual in dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his eyes look like emeralds, she wondered if she'd lost her mind entirely. What was she doing here? What were either of them doing here? The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered, and suddenly the small space felt even smaller. He moved toward her with that same fluid confidence she remembered, but there was something different about him away from the formal setting. Something more relaxed, more real. You came, he said, settling into the chair across from her with obvious relief. You sound surprised. Terrified is more accurate. His smile was self-deprecating, boyish in a way that made her chest flutter. I was convinced you'd wake up this morning and realize this was a terrible idea. I did wake up thinking that, she admitted, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup for warmth. Several times, actually, but terrible ideas have always been my weakness. I remember. His eyes crinkled with genuine amusement. Like the time you convinced me we could dig a tunnel to China if we just tried hard enough. We got 3 feet down before your grandmother found us. Serafina laughed, surprised by how easily the memory surfaced, complete with the smell of earth under their fingernails and the absolute certainty that adventure awaited at the bottom of every hole they dug. She made us fill it back in, but she also brought us lemonade and biscuits afterward. Aurelius's expression grew thoughtful. She always understood that the trying was more important than the succeeding. How is she? Your grandmother? Something flickered across his face, sadness, regret, the weight of time lost. She passed away 5 years ago, peacefully in her sleep. She was 93 and still gardening until the end. I'm so sorry. The words felt inadequate. His grandmother had been a force of nature, all flowing scarves and herbal remedies and stories that made the impossible seem merely improbable. She'd been the one to patch their scraped knees and encourage their wildest schemes, the one who'd taught them both that magic was real if you knew how to look for it. She would have loved knowing I found you again, he said quietly. She never stopped asking about that lovely rose girl with the amber eyes who saw fairies in everything. She remembered me. How could she forget? You were her favorite co-conspirator. His fingers drummed against the table in a nervous rhythm she recognized from childhood. She used to say you had an old soul wrapped in wonder, that you saw the world the way poets wished they could. The compliment, filtered through decades, and delivered in his grandmother's voice, hit her with unexpected force. She was the first person who made me feel like my imagination was a gift instead of something to outgrow. Mine too. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to that intimate register reserved for confessions. When my parents decided we were moving, she fought them harder than I did. Said they were breaking up something precious, something that couldn't be rebuilt once it was damaged. Were we? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Precious, I mean. God, yes. The certainty in his voice was breathtaking. You were the best part of my childhood, Sarah. The best part of everything. The nickname, Sarah, wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. No one had called her that since he'd left. She'd been Serafina to everyone else, formal and proper and adult. But Sarah had been the girl who caught fireflies and believed in magic and loved a golden-haired boy with the kind of pure intensity that only children could manage. Tell me about your life, she said, desperate to steer the conversation away from the dangerous territory of what they'd meant to each other. The official biography mentions tech innovations and business acquisitions, but what's it really like? Being you, I mean. He was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the kind of careful attention he'd once given to choosing the perfect skipping stones. Successful, he said finally. Profitable. Respected. All the things my father wanted it to be. That's not what I asked. No, it isn't. His smile was rueful. It's lonely if I'm being honest. I'm surrounded by brilliant people, but most of them want something from me. Money, connections, access to opportunities. Genuine friendship becomes complicated when you're worth more than some country's GDP. And Valentina? The question emerged more sharply than she'd intended, carrying a hint of jealousy she had no right to feel. Valentina is... He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. She's everything that looks right on paper. Beautiful, intelligent, well-connected. Our families have been pushing the match for years, claiming it would be beneficial for both our business interests. Sounds romantic, Serafina said dryly. About as romantic as a merger agreement. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. She's not a bad person, just... We want different things. She wants the status, the lifestyle, the power that comes with being my wife. I want... He trailed off, his eyes finding hers across the small table. What do you want? What I've always wanted. What I had when I was 10 years old and thought the world was full of infinite possibilities. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I want to feel alive again. The words hung between them like a challenge, a confession, a prayer. Serafina felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling like sand castles at high tide. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. This conversation, this honesty, this glimpse of the boy she'd loved hiding behind the man he'd become. Philippe thinks I'm having a midlife crisis, she said, attempting levity. Are you? Probably. She laughed, surprised by her own honesty. I built a successful business. I have wonderful friends. I travel to beautiful places and acquire lovely things. By any measure, I should be completely content. But sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life. Someone sensible and practical and adult. Someone who's forgotten how to wish on dandelions or believe in impossibilities. She met his eyes, feeling reckless and terrified and more alive than she had in years. Someone who's forgotten what it feels like to love without reservation. Did you? Love without reservation? The question was so quiet, she almost didn't hear it over the cafe's gentle bustle. But she did hear it, and she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she might deny what they'd both known even as children. Yes, she whispered. I loved you with everything I had, everything I was. Past tense, the words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of 27 years, of lives built and choices made, and hearts that had learned to protect themselves. She could lie now, could claim that childhood feelings were safely buried under years of adult experience. She could tell him that what they'd shared was lovely but irrelevant, a sweet memory with no bearing on their present lives. Instead, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, feeling the warmth of his skin, the strength of fingers that had once helped her climb impossible heights. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know if love like that ever really ends or if it just goes underground, waiting for the right moment to break through again. His fingers intertwined with hers, and she felt that familiar electricity, that sense of coming home to a place she'd forgotten existed. "There's something else," he said, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm that sent shivers up her arm. "Something I need to tell you." "What?" "The auction last night. I only went because I heard you'd be there." His admission was rushed, as if he needed to get the words out before he lost his nerve. "I have people who track investments, acquisitions, social events. Your name came up on the guest list, and I couldn't stay away." Serafina stared at him, processing the implications. "You've been keeping track of me?" "Not stalking," he said quickly. "Just aware. I've known about your boutiques for years, about your success, about your husband's death. I'm sorry, by the way. I should have said that last night." "Thank you." She was still reeling from his revelation. "But why? Why keep track if you never intended to contact me?" "Because letting go completely felt like killing the best part of myself." His honesty was devastating in its simplicity. "I told myself I just wanted to know you were happy, that you were living the beautiful life you deserved. But seeing you last night, God, Sarah, it was like discovering I'd been holding my breath for 27 years. The cafe around them had filled with the lunchtime crowd, conversations in French and Italian and English creating a warm buzz of humanity. But Serafina felt as though she and Aurelius existed in their own private world, where truth was the only currency that mattered. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know." His grip on her hand tightened. "I just know I can't walk away again. Not this time. Even if it's complicated, even if it's inconvenient, even if it turns both our lives upside down." "It will," she said softly. "Turn our lives upside down, I mean. I know. Philippe doesn't deserve to be hurt. I know that too. And Valentina will survive just fine. She always does." His smile was grim. "She might even thank me eventually. We both know she deserves someone who can love her the way she wants to be loved." "And what way is that?" "Completely. Without reservation. Without the ghost of a girl in a willow tree haunting every conversation." He brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles that made her breath catch. "The way I've always loved you." Present tense. The words hung in the air like a promise, a challenge, a doorway to a future neither of them had planned but both of them wanted with desperate intensity. "Aurelius, I know it's crazy. I know it's been 27 years and we're different, people with different lives. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is impossible." His green eyes burned with determination. "But I also know that some connections transcend time and logic and practicality. And what we have, what we've always had, is bigger than all the reasons it won't work." She wanted to argue, to point out all the complications and consequences they'd be facing. Instead, she found herself leaning across the table, drawn by forces stronger than gravity. "One condition," she whispered. "Anything. Promise me that if we do this, if we try to find our way back to each other, you won't disappear again. No matter how difficult it gets, no matter what obstacles we face, promise me you'll stay and fight for us this time." "I promise," he said solemnly. And she saw in his eyes the same fierce determination that had once convinced her they could tunnel to China if they just dug deep enough. "Then yes," she breathed. "Yes to whatever this is, whatever it becomes." And as he leaned across the small table to kiss her, finally, after 27 years of waiting, she tasted possibility and danger and the kind of love that could either save them or destroy them completely. She'd never wanted anything more. 3 weeks later, Serafina stood in her Parisian boutique, staring at the vintage Cartier necklace she'd impulsively purchased at the Monaco auction. The piece lay spread across black velvet like captured starlight, beautiful and expensive and completely pointless now that her carefully ordered life was unraveling faster than a poorly knitted sweater. The bell above her door chimed, and she looked up to see Philippe entering with that particular expression of patient concern he'd been wearing since she'd returned from Monaco. He carried 2 cups of coffee from her favorite cafe and moved with the careful deliberation of a man navigating emotional minefields. "Thought you might need caffeine," he said, settling one cup on the counter beside the necklace. "You've been here since dawn again." "Have I?" She glanced at her watch, surprised to discover it was nearly noon. The days had been blurring together, lately a haze of phone calls with Aurelius, sleepless nights, and the growing weight of decisions that needed to be made. Philippe studied her with the gentle persistence of someone who cared too much to pretend everything was normal. "We need to talk, don't we?" The question was so quietly understanding that it nearly broke her heart. This was what made everything so impossibly complicated. Philippe wasn't some cardboard villain she could easily dismiss. He was kind and intelligent and genuinely devoted to her happiness, even when that happiness might not include him. "Yes," she said simply. "We do." He nodded, settling into the antique chair she kept for customers who liked to take their time with decisions. "Is it him? The man from Monaco?" She could have denied it. Could have claimed this was about her own restlessness, her need for change, her desire to travel or expand the business, or any of a dozen other explanations that would spare his feelings. But Philippe had always deserved better than comfortable lies. "Yes, I thought so." He was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers to questions he hadn't wanted to ask. "Are you in love with him?" The truth sat between them like an unexploded bomb, dangerous and inevitable. "I think I always have been." "Since childhood?" "Since childhood." She moved around the counter to sit across from him, needing to see his face when she delivered the blow that would change everything between them. "Philippe, you've been wonderful to me. More than wonderful. You've been patient and understanding and everything a woman could want in a companion. But," his smile was rueful, resigned, "but I can't be the woman you deserve while my heart belongs to someone else." The words tasted like tears and truth and the bitter sweetness of necessary endings. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. Philippe was quiet for a long time, his fingers drumming against his cup in a rhythm that spoke of calculations and careful thinking. When he finally looked up, his dark eyes held sadness but no surprise. "I've suspected for months that part of you was somewhere else," he admitted. "You were present but not entirely here. I told myself it was grief for your husband, or perhaps restlessness with our situation. I never imagined it was love lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to wake up. I'm sorry." The apology felt woefully inadequate. "I never meant for this to happen." "I know." He reached across to squeeze her hand, and she was struck by how different his touch felt compared to Aurelius's, warm and comforting, but lacking that electric current that made her feel like she could power entire cities. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Are you happy? Truly happy for the first time in years?" The question caught her off guard with its perceptiveness. She thought of the past 3 weeks, the daily phone calls that stretched for hours, the text messages that arrived like small gifts throughout the day, the way her heart raced every time her phone rang. She thought of laughing until her cheeks hurt over shared memories, of falling asleep with her phone pressed to her ear listening to Aurelius read her passages from books he thought she'd love, of feeling alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. "Yes," she whispered, terrifyingly, completely happy. "Then I can't be angry." Felipe's smile was genuine despite the sadness around the edges. Disappointed, yes. Heartbroken, certainly. But not angry. "You deserve that kind of happiness. Serafina, everyone does." His grace in the face of heartbreak made her love him in a different way. The way one loves a dear friend, a trusted confidant, someone whose kindness makes the world a better place. It also made her feel even worse about what she was doing to him. "What will you do?" she asked. "Survive," he said with characteristic pragmatism. "Probably travel for a while. I've been thinking about that art acquisition trip to South America I've been postponing. Distance might provide perspective." "Philippe, don't." He held up a hand to stop her apology. "Don't diminish this by making it smaller than it is. And don't cheapen it with excessive guilt. What we had was real and valuable, even if it wasn't forever. Some relationships are meant to be entire lifetimes, others are meant to be beautiful chapters that prepare us for what comes next. His wisdom made her eyes burn with unshed tears. How did you become so wise about matters of the heart? Practice, he said dryly. 62 years of living provides plenty of opportunities to learn about love and loss. This isn't my first heartbreak, though I confess it's the most civilized. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee while sunlight streamed through the boutique's windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. Outside, Paris continued its eternal rhythm, tourists photographing architectural details, lovers strolling hand in hand, life persisting in all its messy, beautiful complexity. There's something else, Serafina said eventually. Something I need to tell you. Philippe raised an eyebrow. More revelations? I'm closing the boutique, this one anyway. The decision had crystallized over the past week, feeling both sudden and inevitable. I'm moving to New York. To be with him? To be with myself first? To figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be who everyone expects me to be. She gestured around the elegant space she'd spent years perfecting. This place is beautiful, but it's also safe, predictable. I think I've been hiding here, surrounding myself with other people's love stories instead of writing my own. And New York won't be hiding? New York will be terrifying, she laughed. Aurelius has offered to help, but I need to do this on my own terms. I need to know that I'm choosing him from a position of strength, not dependence. Philippe nodded approvingly. Smart woman. What about the other boutiques? I'll keep London and Rome, but manage them remotely. Maybe open something in Manhattan. Eventually, when I figure out what that version of my life looks like. When do you leave? Next month. Aurelius has some business to finish in London first. Apparently, ending an engagement is more complicated when both families have financial interest involved. I imagine so. Philippe's expression grew thoughtful. And you're certain about this? About him? 27 years is a long time, and people change. It was the question she'd been asking herself every day since Monaco, the doubt that crept in during quiet moments when logic tried to overrule her heart. Was she making the biggest mistake of her life? Was she throwing away a good relationship for the fantasy of recapturing something that might not even exist anymore? I'm terrified it won't work, she admitted. But I'm more terrified of spending the rest of my life wondering, what if? Some chances only come around once. Twice in your case, Philippe corrected gently. That's either extraordinary luck or destiny intervening. What do you think it is? I think, he said, standing and straightening his jacket with elegant finality, that some stories are too powerful to be denied no matter how inconvenient their timing. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, I hope you're right about him. I hope he's worthy of the magnificent woman I'm losing. Philippe. And Serafina, when you're settled in New York, send me pictures of your new life. I want to see you happy, even if that happiness doesn't include me. After he left, Serafina sat alone among her carefully curated treasures, vintage jewelry that had witnessed decades of love stories, gowns that had danced at long-ago parties, accessories that had traveled through history in the hands of women who'd loved and loved again. Her phone buzzed with a text from Aurelius. Valentina agreed to the mutual announcement. We're officially amicably parting ways to pursue separate paths. Her publicist is already spinning it as two independent spirits choosing authenticity over convention. Another message followed immediately. How are you holding up? I know today was difficult. She typed back, Philippe was incredibly gracious. I don't deserve his kindness. You deserve all the kindness in the world, and so does he. Decent people navigating impossible situations. When will you be in London? Tomorrow night. We're meeting with lawyers Friday to finalize everything. Then I'm free to love you the way I've wanted to for 27 years. The words on her screen blurred as tears finally came. Tears for Philippe's heartbreak, for Valentina's pragmatic disappointment, for all the ways love could be simultaneously beautiful and destructive. But underneath the sadness was something else: anticipation, hope, the thrilling terror of standing at the edge of a cliff and preparing to jump. She looked around her boutique one more time, seeing it not as a sanctuary but as a chrysalis she was finally ready to leave behind. Tomorrow she would start the process of closing this chapter of her life, of packing up the past to make room for an uncertain but infinitely promising future. Her phone buzzed again. "I love you, Sarah. Whatever happens next, whatever obstacles we face, that will never change again." She typed back with fingers that trembled only slightly. "I love you too. Come home to me." Because that's what he was, what he'd always been. Home. And it was time to stop running from the place where her heart had always belonged. 6 months later, Serafina stood on the rooftop terrace of her new Manhattan apartment, watching the sun paint the city skyline in shades of amber and rose. Central Park spread below like an emerald carpet, its autumn trees a symphony of gold and crimson that reminded her of the English countryside where the story had begun so many years ago. The apartment was smaller than her Paris home had been, but it felt infinitely larger, filled with light and possibility, and the kind of space that invited dreams to take root and flourish. She'd chosen it not for its prestigious address or investment potential, but because standing here made her feel like she could see the entire world stretching out before her, full of adventures waiting to be discovered. "You're thinking very loudly again," a familiar voice said behind her. She turned to find Aurelius emerging from the French doors that led to her living room, carrying 2 glasses of wine, and wearing the kind of soft smile that had become as essential to her days as breathing. He'd arrived an hour ago, fresh from a board meeting that had officially transferred control of his European operations to his carefully chosen successors, the final step in restructuring his empire so he could be present for this new chapter of their lives. "Just remembering," she said, accepting the wine and settling into his arms as naturally as if they'd been doing this dance for decades instead of months. "Do you know what today is?" "October 15th, he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "The day you officially became a New York resident according to your lease agreement. It's also exactly 27 years and 7 months since you left Little Brambleworth." She leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his shirt. "I calculated it this morning. Have I mentioned lately that your memory for significant dates is both impressive and slightly terrifying?" His arms tightened around her waist. "What made you think of that?" "I was standing here watching the sunset and thinking about cycles, how some stories end where they began but at a higher level of understanding." She gestured toward the park below, where couples walked hand in hand and children played on, swings that arced toward the sky like prayers in motion. "We spent our childhood believing in impossible things, then spent our adult years learning to be practical and sensible. And now we're children again, but with better wine and significantly improved kissing techniques," he finished, making her laugh. "Exactly." She turned in his arms to face him, still amazed by the way his presence could make even this spectacular view seem secondary. "Are you happy, Aurelius? Truly happy with how everything turned out?" It was a question she'd stopped asking herself weeks ago, but she needed to know that he felt the same certainty that had settled into her bones like sunlight. The transition hadn't been without its challenges. The media attention around his broken engagement, the logistics of restructuring their lives across 2 continents, the inevitable adjustment period of learning to love each other as adults rather than children. "Look at me," he said, cupping her face in his hands with the kind of reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts. "I'm standing on a rooftop in Manhattan with the woman I've loved for 30 years, watching the sunset paint the city gold while planning our future together. If I were any happier, I'd probably spontaneously combust." 30 years? She raised an eyebrow. "We've only known each other for 27 years and 6 months. I started loving you before I met you," he said with such simple sincerity that her heart stuttered. The moment moment I was born, some part of me was already looking for you. It just took me 3 years to find you. That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or evidence that you've been reading too much poetry. Can it be both? He grinned, and she saw in his expression the same mischievous joy that had convinced her to climb impossible trees and dig tunnels to China. Besides, you're one to talk. Who was it that insisted we needed to plant a garden on this terrace because every love story deserves flowers? She glanced toward the corner where they'd spent last weekend planting herbs and autumn blooms in carefully chosen containers. It wasn't the sprawling English garden of her childhood dreams, but it was theirs. A small patch of growing things in the heart of the concrete jungle, proof that love could take root anywhere if tended with enough care. The garden was practical, she protested. Fresh herbs for cooking, beauty for the soul, a connection to the earth in an urban environment. The garden was romantic as hell, and you know it. He spun her around, making her wine slosh dangerously close to the rim of her glass. Just like this apartment, just like your new boutique concept, just like everything you touch. You turn ordinary things into magic. I do not. You absolutely do. He stopped spinning but kept his hands on her waist, his green eyes serious despite the playful turn their conversation had taken. You've always done it. Even as a child, you could look at a handful of dandelion seeds and see wishes waiting to be born. You taught me that the world was full of wonder, and then you spent 27 years teaching yourself to forget that lesson. And now? Now you're remembering. And watching you remember is like watching someone come back to life. His voice dropped to that intimate register that made her feel like they were the only two people in the universe. Do you know what my favorite part of every day is? When you steal the covers and pretend it's an accident. When you wake up in the morning and, for just a split second before you're fully conscious, you smile. His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. It's this unconscious, purely happy expression that tells me you're exactly where you want to be. I've been waiting 30 years to see that smile. The confession undid her completely. She set down her wine glass and rose on her tiptoes to kiss him with all the love and gratitude and sheer joy that words couldn't contain. He tasted like expensive wine and shared dreams and the promise of countless mornings when she'd wake up exactly where she wanted to be. I have something for you, she said when they finally broke apart, both of them breathing harder than the kiss strictly warranted. It's not my birthday. It's better than your birthday. It's the anniversary of the day you promised to find me again. She disappeared into the apartment and returned with a small wrapped package that she placed in his hands with ceremonial solemnity. Open it. He unwrapped it with the careful attention he gave to everything that mattered to him, revealing a simple wooden box that looked like it had been crafted by hand decades ago. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a pressed dandelion, yellow petals dulled with age but still recognizable, still impossibly intact. Sarah. His voice was thick with emotion. I kept it, she said simply. The dandelion you gave me the day before you left. I pressed it in my grandmother's Bible and carried it with me through every move, every major life event, every moment when I needed to remember that magic was real. He lifted the delicate flower from its resting place, holding it like the precious relic it was. You kept it for 27 years. I kept it forever, just like I kept my love for you, and my belief that somehow, someday you'd keep your promise. She smiled, feeling tears spill over despite her joy. And you did. You found me again. We found each other, he corrected, setting the dandelion carefully back in its box before pulling her into his arms. And this time, no one can take us away from each other. Promise? I promise, he said solemnly, echoing words spoken by a 10-year-old boy with dirt under his fingernails and love in his heart. I promise to love you in all the ways I didn't know existed when we were children. I promise to build a life with you that honors both who we were and who we're becoming. I promise to never stop believing in the magic we create together. Those are very big promises. Good thing I have a very big love to back them up. He gestured toward the city spreading out below them, millions of lights beginning to twinkle as darkness fell. Speaking of which, there's something I need to ask you. What's that? He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that made her breath catch in her throat. But instead of dropping to one knee, he simply held it out to her with a smile that held 30 years of patient love. "Serafina Rose Delacroix," he said, "would you like to plant a garden with me? Not just here on this terrace, but everywhere we go for the rest of our lives? Would you like to dig new tunnels to impossible places and catch fireflies in mason jars and teach our children, if we're blessed with them, that the world is full of magic if you know how to look for it? Are you asking me to marry you or join a gardening club?" She laughed through her tears. "I'm asking you to marry me and spend the rest of our lives proving that some love stories are so powerful they can wait decades for their proper ending." He opened the box to reveal a ring that took her breath away, not because of its size or cost, but because of its perfect simplicity. A single diamond surrounded by delicate gold work that looked like it could have been crafted from captured starlight. "Will you, Sarah?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and she marveled at how perfectly it fit, as if it had been waiting for her finger as long as they'd been waiting for each other. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of 3 decades and the promise of all the decades to come. "I love you too," he replied, kissing her as the last light faded from the sky and the city below them sparkled like a constellation fallen to earth. Later, as they sat curled together on the terrace furniture they'd chosen specifically for moments like these, Serafina thought about the journey that had brought them here. The pain of separation, the years of building separate lives, the encounter that had changed everything. It hadn't been a straight path from childhood love to adult happiness, but perhaps that was what made it precious, the knowledge that they'd chosen each other not once but twice, with full understanding of what that choice meant. "Do you think your grandmother would approve?" she asked, watching Aurelius trace patterns on her arm with his fingertips. "Are you kidding? She'd probably claim she orchestrated the whole thing from beyond the veil." His laugh was warm with fond memory. "She always said true love finds a way even when it seems impossible. Smart woman. The smartest. She also said that the best gardens grow from soil that's been broken up and enriched with time and experience." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "We're going to have an extraordinary garden, Sarah." "The most extraordinary," she agreed, closing her eyes and letting herself sink into the perfect contentment of being exactly where she belonged. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, distant suns that had traveled unimaginable distances to share their light, and below them, the city hummed with 8 million stories in progress, loves found and lost, dreams chased and caught, hearts learning that sometimes the most beautiful endings were really just the beginning of something even more wonderful. In her apartment full of light and possibility, surrounded by the man who'd kept his childhood promise and the evidence of a love that had survived decades of separation, Serafina finally understood what her grandmother had always known. That some magic was too powerful to be lost no matter how long it waited in the darkness, and tomorrow, she would wake up with that unconscious smile Aurelius loved so much, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to love, for exactly as long as forever lasted. After 30 years of searching, she was finally completely magnificently home,